Before the first secret is whispered and the cold rain of a divided Europe begins to fall, I invite you to find a place of absolute stillness. Let the world of the present, with its bright screens and constant noise, fade into a soft, gray blur. Imagine yourself wrapped in a heavy wool coat, the kind worn by travelers in the 1970s, standing on a mist-shrouded platform as a steamless train pulls away. Feel the cool, damp air of London against your skin and the steady, grounding weight of your own presence. Breathe in slowly, catching the scent of old paper, tobacco, and rain-soaked pavement, and as you exhale, let go of every tension in your jaw, your shoulders, and your hands. There is no rush in this world of shadows. Time here moves with the deliberate, heavy pace of a ticking clock in a silent office. You are safe, you are anonymous, and you are ready to slip into a story where the truth is a luxury and love is the most dangerous mission of all. The year was 1974, and London was a city of perpetual twilight, caught in the grip of a winter that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The sky was the color of a tarnished silver spoon, and the fog rolled off the Thames in thick, yellow waves, swallowing the black cabs and the red buses until they were nothing more than ghostly headlights in the gloom. In a nondescript office building near Cambridge Circus, a place where the paint was peeling and the air smelled of stale tea and damp wool, Andrew sat at his desk, staring at a file that didn't officially exist. Andrew was a man of quiet edges and careful silences, a career officer in the service who had learned long ago that the most important things are never said aloud. His face was a map of controlled emotions, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, always searching for the inconsistency in a report or the shadow in a photograph that shouldn't be there. Across the English Channel, Paris was shivering under a different kind of cold. The city of light had turned into a city of echoes, the grand boulevards swept by a biting wind that rattled the bistro chairs and sent the dead leaves dancing across the Place de la Concorde. Jennifer stood by the window of her apartment in the Marais, watching the rain streak the glass like tears on a windowpane. She was a woman of sharp intelligence and a grace that felt almost accidental, an analyst for the French intelligence services who specialized in the invisible threads that connected Moscow to the heart of Europe. Her life was a series of encrypted cables and midnight meetings in dimly lit cafes, an existence where her real name was rarely used and her true feelings were kept under lock and key. She was the best at what she did because she understood that in their world, information was the only currency that never devalued. Their paths were destined to cross in the gray zone where duty and desire become indistinguishable. The mission was codenamed Glass Horizon, a delicate operation involving a high-level defector who claimed to have the names of every mole embedded in Western European intelligence. Andrew had been dispatched to Paris to coordinate the handoff, a task that required the kind of surgical precision he was known for. He checked into a small, nondescript hotel near the Gare du Nord, a place where the carpets were worn thin and the wallpaper was stained with decades of tobacco smoke. He felt the weight of the city pressing in on him, the sense that every waiter and every passerby was a potential observer. In the world of the Cold War, paranoia was not a symptom, it was a survival mechanism. The first meeting took place in the Jardin des Tuileries, under the skeletal branches of the chestnut trees. The air was so cold that their breath turned to white plumes, and the gravel crunched loudly under their feet. Andrew waited near the fountain, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his eyes scanning the perimeter with the practiced ease of a predator. When Jennifer approached, she was wearing a dark trench coat and a silk scarf that fluttered in the wind. She didn't look like a spy, she looked like a woman lost in thought, a part of the Parisian landscape. They didn't shake hands, they simply fell into step beside each other, two shadows moving through the fading light. "The package is moving," Jennifer said, her voice low and steady, a melody that felt strangely familiar to Andrew even though they had never met. "But the wind is changing." Moscow is nervous. Andrew glanced at her, noting the sharp curve of her jaw and the way the damp air had made her hair curl slightly at the temples. We move at dawn, he replied, his own voice a raspy whisper. The channel crossing is arranged. We just need to get him to the coast. In that moment, amidst the talk of defectors and extraction routes, a different kind of connection was forged. It was a recognition of shared loneliness, a silent acknowledgement that they were both ghosts in their own lives. For years, Andrew had lived for the service, his personal life a series of shallow relationships and empty apartments. Seeing Jennifer, seeing the way she held herself with a mixture of strength and a hidden, flickering vulnerability, woke something in him that he had thought was long dead. It was a dangerous feeling, a crack in the armor he had spent a lifetime building. They spent the evening in a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a cramped apartment filled with the hum of a shortwave radio and the smell of cheap coffee. As they pored over maps and timetables, the professional distance between them began to erode. They spoke of things that had nothing to do with the mission, of the books they had read, the music they missed, and the places they wanted to see when the world finally stopped holding its breath. Jennifer spoke of her childhood in the French countryside, of the scent of lavender and the warmth of the sun on old stone walls. Andrew spoke of the mist on the Scottish Highlands and the quiet dignity of the London libraries. As the clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, the tension in the room shifted. It was no longer just about the mission, it was about the two people caught in its gears. Andrew reached out, his hand hovering over hers on the map, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. The Cold War, the defectors, the secrets, they all vanished, replaced by the warmth of a human touch in a world of ice. Jennifer didn't pull away, she turned her hand over, her fingers locking with his, a silent pact made in the shadow of a brewing storm. "We shouldn't do this," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "I know," Andrew replied, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming certainty. "But I don't think I can stop." Outside, the Paris rain turned to sleet, and the wind howled through the narrow streets, a reminder of the harsh reality that waited for them at dawn. But inside the small apartment, for a few precious hours, there was a sanctuary of heat and light. They were no longer Andrew and Jennifer, the agents of a divided world, they were simply two souls seeking shelter in each other's arms, knowing that the morning would bring the hardest mission of their lives. The glass horizon was waiting, and the shadows were closing in, but for tonight, the only truth that mattered was the rhythm of their shared breathing in the dark. The gray light of a Parisian dawn filtered through the heavy, moth-eaten curtains of the safe house, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. The air in the room had grown cold as the radiator hissed and clattered in a futile struggle against the French winter. Andrew watched Jennifer as she slept for a few final, stolen moments. Her breathing was rhythmic and shallow, a contrast to the jagged chaos of the world waiting outside the door. In the dim light, the lines of exhaustion around her eyes seemed to soften, revealing the woman she might have been in a world without borders, without microdots, and without the crushing weight of the Official Secrets Act. He felt a pang of something sharper than regret, a realization that they were both tethered to a fading ideology, soldiers in a war fought with whispers and betrayal, while the heart demanded a different kind of surrender. He stood up quietly, his joints stiff from the cramped armchair, and moved to the small kitchenette. The coffee he brewed was thick and bitter, the scent of it cutting through the musty smell of the apartment. As the liquid dripped slowly into the pot, he checked his watch, 5:15. The extraction window was narrow. Their package, a middle-aged Soviet trade delegate named Volkov who carried the keys to a kingdom of lies, was waiting at a dead drop near the Canal Saint-Martin. Andrew checked his Browning high power, the cold steel of the slide a grounding reality against the ethereal dreams of the night before. He holstered the weapon, the leather creaking slightly, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Jennifer stirred, her eyes opening with the instant, sharp clarity of a field agent. There was no transition from sleep to wakefulness, she was simply present, her mind already calculating the variables of the morning. She looked at Andrew, and for a heartbeat, the warmth of the previous night flashed between them, a silent bridge over the widening abyss of their professional duties. "It's time," she said, her voice a low rasp that sent a shiver down Andrew's spine. She sat up, smoothing her dark hair with a practiced, efficient motion. "The car is 2 blocks away. A grey Peugeot. The plates are French, but the engine is British. It'll get us to the coast if we don't hit too many checkpoints." They moved through the streets of Paris as the city began to wake. The boulangeries were opening, the smell of fresh bread mocking the sterile tension of their mission. The fog had returned, thick and cloying, clinging to the ironwork of the balconies and dampening the sound of the Peugeot's engine. Andrew drove with a relaxed posture that hid a coiled readiness, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. Jennifer sat beside him, the map unfolded on her lap, though she knew the route by heart. They were a team now, a unit formed in the crucible of a safe house, and yet the irony was not lost on Andrew. The better they performed their jobs, the sooner they would be separated by the very bureaucracies they served. They found Volkov shivering in the shadow of a warehouse, his expensive overcoat looking out of place against the grime of the canal. He was a man possessed by a singular, frantic terror, his eyes darting toward every shadow. As he scrambled into the back seat of the car, the air inside suddenly became heavy with the scent of his fear, a metallic, sour smell that Andrew knew all too well. "You have it?" Andrew asked, not looking back, his focus on pulling smoothly into the sparse morning traffic. "I have everything," Volkov hissed, clutching a battered leather briefcase to his chest as if it were a holy relic. "Names. Dates. The Directorate's sleepers in London. But we must go. They know. I can feel them behind me." The drive toward the coast was a study in controlled anxiety. The French countryside blurred past in shades of charcoal and olive green, the leafless poplars standing like sentinels along the Route Nationale. Every police van, every roadside breakdown, felt like a potential trap. They bypassed the main highways, sticking to the secondary roads that wound through sleepy villages where the only observers were old men in berets and stray dogs. Jennifer handled the navigation with a cold brilliance, her fingers tracing the veins of the map, her voice providing a steady, calm cadence that kept Volkov from spiraling into hysterics. "We're making good time," she murmured, glancing at Andrew. The look they shared was brief but heavy. It was the look of two people who knew that once they reached the sea, the rules of the game would change. Volkov was a prize for London, Jennifer was an asset of Paris. The glass horizon protocol dictated that once the asset was secured on British soil, the French involvement ended. Andrew would disappear into the labyrinth of the service, and Jennifer would return to the shadows of the Marais. As they neared the port of Dieppe, the air took on the salt-tangled scent of the English Channel. The sky was a bruised purple, the clouds hanging low and heavy with the threat of snow. The safe house near the docks was a dilapidated fisherman's cottage, its wood silvered by the sea spray and its windows encrusted with salt. They pulled the Peugeot into a rusted corrugated iron shed and hurried Volkov inside. The interior of the cottage was cold, the only light coming from a single kerosene lamp that threw flickering, distorted shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Outside, the waves crashed against the shingle beach with a relentless, rhythmic thud, a sound like the ticking of a cosmic clock. Andrew moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters at the dark expanse of the water. Somewhere out there, a Royal Navy fast patrol boat was waiting, a black shape against a blacker sea. "The signal will come at 2200 hours, Andrew said, turning back to the room. Jennifer was standing by the fireplace, though no fire was lit. She looked small in the vast, cold room, the bravado of the office replaced by a quiet, haunting stillness. Volkov had slumped into a corner, his head resting against his knees, the adrenaline of the flight finally giving way to exhaustion. "And then?" Jennifer asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. Andrew walked over to her, the space between them filled with the unspoken words of a dozen unwritten reports. "And then I take him across. The debriefing will take weeks. The names he carries will change everything, Jennifer. It's the breakthrough we've waited for." "For the service," she said, a hint of bitterness touching her tone. "But what about the people in the room, Andrew? What about the 24 hours where we weren't just parts of a machine?" Andrew took her hands in his, they were ice cold. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of her, the faint rosewater and the lingering smell of the morning's coffee, was the only thing that felt real in the world of shifting allegiances. "I won't let it be just 24 hours. I don't know how yet, but this isn't the end of the file." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his for a promise he wasn't officially allowed to make. "In our world, Andrew, later is a dangerous word. We live in the now because the later is usually owned by someone else." As the hours crawled toward 10, the tension in the cottage reached a fever pitch. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the wind against the shutters, sounded like a breach. They sat in the dark, the kerosene lamp extinguished to avoid detection, listening to the heartbeat of the sea. It was a period of suspended animation, a liminal space where the past and future were irrelevant. There was only the cold, the salt, and the desperate, hidden heat between them. Suddenly, a faint, rhythmic flash of white light cut through the darkness of the channel. 1, 2, 3. "The signal," Andrew whispered. He helped Volkov to his feet, the man stumbling in his haste. Jennifer moved to the door, her hand on the latch, her eyes fixed on Andrew. This was the moment of the handoff, the point where the mission achieved its objective and the human cost began to be tallied. "Go," she said, her voice firm now, the professional mask firmly back in place. "I'll hold the perimeter until I hear the engines. The French team will be here in 20 minutes to scrub the site." Andrew paused at the threshold, the cold sea air rushing in to fill the room. He reached out and touched Jennifer's cheek, a brief, searing contact that felt like a brand. "London. The park at Greenwich. The first Sunday of next month. High noon." She didn't answer with words, but the way her hand lingered on the doorframe as he led Volkov out into the night was answer enough. He moved across the shingle beach, the stones crunching under his boots, the wind whipping his coat around his legs. The patrol boat was a dark, low-slung shape waiting just beyond the surf, its engine a muffled growl. As the sailors reached out to pull Volkov aboard, Andrew looked back one last time. The cottage was a dark silhouette against the grey cliffs of Dieppe. He couldn't see Jennifer, but he knew she was there, a shadow among shadows, watching him depart. As the boat turned its bow toward England and accelerated into the churning white foam of the channel, Andrew felt a sense of profound displacement. He was carrying the secrets that would win a war, but he felt as though he had left the only thing worth fighting for on a cold, French shore. The North Sea was a churning cauldron of slate-gray water and white-capped defiance as the patrol boat cut its way toward the English coast. Andrew stood on the narrow deck, his legs braced against the violent pitching of the vessel, the salt spray stinging his eyes and coating his wool coat in a fine, crystalline rime. Behind him, in the cramped, oil-scented cabin, Volkov was a huddle of misery, the high-stakes defector reduced to a seasick passenger clutching a briefcase that held the power to dismantle networks from East Berlin to London. But Andrew's mind was not on the man or the mission. His thoughts were anchored back on that shingle beach in Dieppe, tracing the silhouette of a woman who had become his only true north in a world of shifting magnetic poles. He looked at the horizon, where the first pale streaks of a British morning were beginning to bleed through the clouds, and felt the crushing weight of the silence he was returning to. The arrival at a secluded naval pier in Kent was a masterpiece of choreographed anonymity. Men in heavy overcoats, their faces obscured by the pre-dawn mist, moved with silent efficiency, whisking Volkov into a waiting black Vanden Plas. Andrew watched them go, the professional part of his brain registering the successful completion of Phase 1, while the rest of his being felt strangely hollow. He was driven back to London in a separate car, watching the familiar landscape of the Garden of England slide past the window, the oast houses, the dormant orchards, the grey stone churches. It was a world of stability and tradition, the very things he was paid to protect, yet it felt like a stage set, thin and fragile, compared to the raw intensity of the last 48 hours in Paris. Back at the service headquarters, the atmosphere was one of suppressed electricity. The news of Volkov's arrival had filtered through the upper echelons, and the in-tray on Andrew's desk was already overflowing with high-priority memos. He was summoned almost immediately to a briefing room on the 4th floor, a windowless space paneled in dark oak and smelling of floor wax and expensive tobacco. His superiors, men with tired eyes and impeccable tailoring, listened as he recounted the extraction. He kept his report clinical and precise, omitting the warmth of the safe house and the touch of Jennifer's hand. In their world, such details were not just irrelevant, they were liabilities. The French played their part well, one of the senior officers remarked, puffing on a pipe. Though they'll likely want a seat at the table during the primary debriefing. We'll have to manage that. Good work, Andrew. Take 24 hours to clear your head, then we start the deep dive into Volkov's lists. Andrew walked out of the building into the biting London air, the noise of the traffic on the Strand sounding unnaturally loud after the hushed corridors of the service. He didn't go back to his apartment, a minimalist space in Chelsea that felt more like a transit lounge than a home. Instead, he walked toward the river, leaning against the cold stone of the embankment and watching the tugs pull their barges through the murky water. He felt like a man living in two dimensions, the physical reality of London and the emotional ghost world of Paris. He found himself checking his watch constantly, calculating where Jennifer would be, what she would be doing. Was she back at her desk in the Marais? Was she being debriefed by her own superiors, her face a mask of professional indifference just as his had been? The days that followed were a blur of fluorescent lights and endless transcripts. Volkov was a fountain of information, but the data was fragmented, a jigsaw puzzle of codenames and dead-letter boxes. Andrew spent 16 hours a day in a secure basement, cross-referencing names and dates, his eyes burning from the strain of reading grainy microfilm. Every time he came across a French connection, his heart skipped a beat, a reflexive hope that he might find her name, or a reason to pick up the secure line to Paris. But there was nothing. The glass horizon protocol had done its job too well, the curtain had fallen, and the two actors were back in their separate theaters. Meanwhile, in Paris, Jennifer was navigating a different kind of storm. Her superiors were pleased with the result but suspicious of the rapport she had established with the British operative. In the world of espionage, cooperation is always tempered by the fear of being turned. She sat through hours of questioning, her answers as sharp and clear as a winter morning, never allowing a hint of the internal fire to reach her eyes. She lived for the small moments of privacy, the walk home past the cafe where they had first spoken, the quiet half-hour in her apartment before sleep, clutching a silk scarf that still held a faint, lingering scent of the London mist. She thought of the park at Greenwich, the date Andrew had whispered on the threshold of the cottage. It was a madness, a breach of every security protocol they had been trained to uphold. To meet in the heart of the capital, under the watchful eyes of both services, was an act of quiet rebellion. Yet, it was the only thing that kept her moving through the grey bureaucracy of her days. She began to prepare, not for a mission, but for a possibility. She studied the ferry schedules, the train routes, the patterns of the channel crossings. She was an analyst, she knew how to find the gaps in the surveillance, the blind spots in the glass horizon. Back in London, the first Sunday of the month approached with an agonizing slowness. Andrew felt like a man preparing for an execution or a coronation, he wasn't sure which. He spent his Saturday wandering through the shops on Jermyn Street, buying a new coat he didn't need and a book of poetry he knew he wouldn't read. He was trying to anchor himself to the physical world, to prevent his nerves from fraying entirely. He looked at the sky, praying for a clear day, as if the weather itself were a collaborator in his secret. On the Sunday morning, London was hushed, the city sleeping off the excesses of a Saturday night. Andrew took the river boat down to Greenwich, the water a cold, shimmering ribbon of steel. He walked up the hill toward the Royal Observatory, the grass damp with dew, the trees skeletal against the pale blue of the winter sky. He stood by the meridian line, the invisible boundary between east and west, and waited. The wind was sharp, tugging at his collar, but he didn't feel the cold. He looked down toward the Thames, watching the distant shapes of the ships, his heart drumming a steady, frantic rhythm against his ribs. High noon came and went. The bell of a distant church chimed the hour, the sound carried away by the wind. Andrew scanned the paths, his eyes searching every figure that climbed the hill. A family with a barking dog, a group of students with cameras, an elderly couple holding hands, none of them were her. A cold knot of dread began to tighten in his stomach. Had she been stopped? Had the service discovered the plan? Or had she simply decided that the cost was too high, that the now they had shared was enough? He stayed for another hour, his shadow lengthening on the grass, a solitary figure in a landscape of indifference. He was about to turn away, to begin the long walk back to the life of shadows, when he saw a flash of dark fabric near the tea-house. A woman was walking toward him, her pace steady but hurried, a silk scarf fluttering in the wind. She didn't look like an agent, she looked like a woman who had traveled a long way to find something she had lost. Andrew felt a surge of warmth that seemed to melt the very air around him. He didn't run, he couldn't. He stood his ground as Jennifer reached the crest of the hill, her face flushed from the climb and the cold, her eyes searching his with a desperate, beautiful intensity. They stood on the meridian line, 1 foot in the east, 1 foot in the west, the world of the Cold War and the glass horizon reduced to a backdrop for their defiance. "You came," Andrew whispered, his voice catching in the wind. "The wind was in my favor," Jennifer replied, her smile breaking through the tension like the sun through the London fog. They didn't touch, not yet. They stood in the quiet of the park, two ghosts who had finally found a haunting ground they could call their own. The mission was over, the secrets were filed away, and for one Sunday afternoon in Greenwich, the horizon was no longer made of glass, it was as wide and as deep as the sea they had crossed to find each other. The wind at the top of Greenwich Hill was a biting, relentless force, tugging at the hem of Jennifer's dark coat and whistling through the iron railings of the observatory. For a long, suspended minute, neither of them moved. The space between them was charged with the static of 1,000 unspoken regulations and the heavy, invisible presence of the glass horizon protocol. To any casual observer, they were merely two people meeting in a park on a cold Sunday, a common enough sight in London. But in the specialized optics of the intelligence world, they were a glaring anomaly, a breach in the carefully curated surface of Cold War reality. Andrew looked at her, memorizing the way the winter light caught the amber flecks in her eyes, and felt a profound sense of vertigo. He was standing on the prime meridian, the line that divided the world into east and west, and he realized with a jolt of clarity that he no longer belonged to either. "You're shivering," Andrew said, his voice barely a murmur against the gale. It was a mundane observation, yet it carried the weight of a confession. He took a step toward her, breaking the formal distance that had been their only protection. Jennifer managed a small, tired smile. The crossing was complicated. The hovercraft from Calais was delayed by the swell, and I thought for a moment the Dover clerks would take an interest in my papers. They're becoming more thorough, Andrew. The atmosphere in Paris is turning brittle. She reached out, her gloved hand brushing the sleeve of his coat. "I wasn't sure you'd be here. A park in the middle of the capital? It violates every page of the training manual." "The manual doesn't have a chapter for what happened in Dieppe," Andrew replied. He moved closer, shielding her from the wind with his broader frame. "Volkov is in a safe house in Sussex. He's talking. He's given us the names of the Directorate sleepers in the Midlands. The service is ecstatic, Jennifer. They're already preparing the medals and the promotions. But all I can think about is that the more successful the mission is, the more they'll expect me to return to the machine. They want me in Berlin next month. A permanent posting." Jennifer's expression darkened, the light in her eyes dimming like a guttering candle. "And I have been assigned to the Brussels desk. Coordination with NATO. It's a career-making move, or so they tell me." She looked away, toward the grey ribbon of the Thames snaking through the city below. "We are being rewarded for our efficiency by being moved further apart. The system is self-correcting, Andrew. It senses a deviation, a human connection, and it moves to neutralize it by increasing the distance." They began to walk, moving slowly down the sloping paths of the park toward the Maritime Museum. They stayed close but didn't hold hands, maintaining the outward appearance of casual acquaintances for the sake of any telescopic lenses that might be trained on the hill. The trees around them were bare, their black branches scratching at the sky like the nibs of fountain pens recording a secret history. Andrew felt a desperate need to find a way out, a gap in the fence that didn't involve betrayal or a bullet. "There is a file," Andrew began, his voice dropping to a frequency that wouldn't carry. "Something Volkov mentioned during the third day of debriefing. He spoke of a neutral channel, a group of officers on both sides who have grown tired of the stalemate. They facilitate disappearances. Not for defectors with secrets, but for people who simply want to cease to exist in the eyes of their departments. It's called the Mirror Path." Jennifer stopped in her tracks, her breath hitching. "The Mirror Path is a myth, Andrew. A campfire story told by burned-out agents in the bars of Vienna. If you go looking for it, you're more likely to find a shallow grave in the woods than a new life." "I don't think it's a myth," Andrew insisted, his gaze steady. I saw the look on the chief's face when the transcript came through. He had that section suppressed immediately. It wasn't because it was nonsense, it was because it was true. There are people like us, Jennifer. People who have spent so long living behind masks that they've forgotten the color of their own souls. And some of them found a way to take the masks off. They reached the lower level of the park, where the sounds of the city began to filter back in, the rumble of a distant train, the honk of a tugboat on the river. The reality of their situation was closing in. Jennifer had a ferry to catch, a return to a life of encrypted cables and silent dinners. Andrew had a report to finish that would determine the fate of men he would never meet. The Sunday afternoon was hemorrhaging time, the golden hour of their meeting turning into the leaden shadows of the approaching dusk. If we tried, Jennifer whispered, her eyes searching his, if we actually looked for this path, we would be hunted. Not just by Moscow, but by our own people. To the service, a man who walks away is more dangerous than a man who betrays. Betrayal they understand. Leaving. That suggests the game isn't worth playing. They can't allow that thought to spread. I'd rather be hunted with you than safe without you, Andrew said, and the simplicity of the statement felt like the most radical thing he had ever uttered. In the world of 1974, where the map was divided by iron curtains and nuclear silos, the idea of two people choosing each other over their flags was a form of high treason. Jennifer reached into her bag and pulled out a small, silver lighter, a gift from a contact in Prague years ago. She turned it over in her fingers, the metal cold and familiar. London is a city of clocks, Andrew. Everyone is watching the time. But in Paris, we have the cafés. There is a small place in Montmartre, away from the tourists. The Café des Spectres. If you find a way to get a message to the bookshop on Rue de Seine, the one with the green door, under the name Martin, I will know. I will wait for the signal. She leaned in then, a brief, desperate press of her lips against his cheek that lasted only a second but felt like an eternity. The scent of her, the rosewater and the faint, metallic tang of the winter air, stayed with him long after she pulled away. I have to go, she said, her voice cracking for the first time. The boat won't wait, and neither will the service. Greenwich, the first Sunday, Andrew reminded her, his heart heavy as lead. Until the signal. He watched her walk away, her figure growing smaller as she moved toward the pier. She didn't look back. In their trade, looking back was a gesture for amateurs, a weakness that could get you killed. He stood by the ancient stone walls of the park, a man who had just traded his loyalty for a hope as thin as a spider's silk. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the lights of London began to flicker on, thousands of yellow eyes watching the darkness. Andrew turned and walked toward the station, his mind already beginning to map the contours of the mirror path, searching for the hidden door in the glass horizon. The final movement of the glass horizon was not a clash of brass and drums, but a silent, irreversible shift in the frequency of two lives. Andrew returned to the windowless archives of the service, his eyes blurring over the endless stream of intercepted cables and field reports, but his mind was now a finely tuned instrument searching for a ghost. He spent his nights in the basement levels, where the files from the 1950s lay in dusty, forgotten stacks, looking for the operational DNA of the mirror path. He found it in a footnote of a failed operation in Trieste, a mention of a backdoor, created by officers who realized that the map they were fighting over was a fiction. The path was not a physical road, but a sequence of dead letter boxes and broken signals that, when followed correctly, allowed an operative to fall through the cracks of the world and vanish. In Paris, Jennifer played her part with a chilling, clockwork perfection. She accepted her promotion to the Brussels desk, moving through the bureaucratic rituals of her departure with a grace that masked her internal rebellion. She visited the bookshop on Rue de Seine, placing a folded 10-franc note inside a specific edition of Apollinaire's poetry. The message was simple: a date, a time, and the word mirror. She felt the eyes of her own department on her, the subtle tail in the metro, the way her phone line clicked with the telltale sign of a recording device. She was a bird in a cage of her own making, but she knew that the lock was about to be turned from the inside. The night of the final extraction was a masterpiece of 1970s atmosphere. A cold, driving rain lashed the streets of London, and the fog over the English Channel was so thick that the ferry crossings were suspended. Andrew walked out of his office at 1800 hours, leaving his coat on the rack and his briefcase on the desk, as if he had just stepped out for a packet of cigarettes. He took the tube to Victoria, then a series of buses that zigzagged across the city, shedding his identity with every transfer. By midnight, he was standing at a small, private airfield in Essex, where a light aircraft was fueled and waiting. The pilot, a man whose face was a map of old scars and hidden loyalties, didn't ask for a passport. He only asked for the mirror passphrase. Simultaneously, Jennifer was standing on a bridge over the Seine, the lights of the city reflecting in the dark, churning water. She dropped her service-issued sidearm into the river, a final, heavy splash that signaled the end of her life as an asset. She walked to a waiting car, a nondescript black Citroën driven by a man who had once been a legendary station chief in Algiers but had long ago been declared dead by the French ministry. They drove through the night toward the northern coast, bypassing the main checkpoints and using the narrow farm roads that only the locals and the ghosts knew. They met at a derelict lighthouse on the Belgian border, a place where the land ends and the grey infinity of the sea begins. The air was freezing, the salt spray mixing with the rain to create a stinging, icy mist. When Andrew stepped out of the shadows, he saw Jennifer standing by the rusted iron door, her face pale but her eyes burning with a fierce, triumphant light. There were no debriefings here, no protocols, and no glass horizon. There were only two people who had successfully betrayed everyone except each other. "The path is open," Andrew said, his voice steady for the first time in years. "And the masks are gone," Jennifer replied, reaching out to take his hand. Her fingers were no longer cold, they were the only warm thing in a world of ice. They boarded a small fishing boat that was waiting in the lee of the cliffs. As the engine sputtered to life and the vessel turned its bow toward the open sea, the lights of Europe began to fade into a distant, inconsequential glow. They weren't going to a new country or a new mission, they were going into the silence, into the gaps between the lines of the history books. To the service in London and the bureau in Paris, they would eventually be listed as presumed defected or lost at sea, their files closed and moved to the deep archives. But as the boat cut through the dark waves, Andrew and Jennifer were finally, for the first time in their lives, no longer shadows. They were the horizon itself. The mission was complete. The secrets had been traded for a life, and the Cold War had lost two of its finest soldiers to a peace that didn't appear on any map. As the boat disappeared into the morning fog, the only thing left behind was the steady, rhythmic sound of the waves, a sound that, if you listened closely, whispered of a love that had proven more durable than any empire.